Welcome to the Berggruen Forum, everybody. Thank you for coming. Reminder that there's free tea and coffee there if you want it. Just one announcement. Next week's Berggruen Forum on November the 17th will be given by Isaac Madsen. Isaac is a US Army veteran with an MA in military history. The title of his talk is Sand, Sweat and Swearing, Experiences as a Mechanized Infantry Platoon Leader at Fort Bliss, Texas. Should be very interesting. And today, we're very happy to have a team of Alfred University librarians, John Hosford, Samantha Dannick, Mechele Romanchock, and Kevin Adams, and they are going to give a talk entitled, What is Information Literacy Anyway? So thank you.
Hey, welcome again. Thank you for joining us. And as Amra said, we have assembled before you today a group of librarians, and I'm Mechele Romanchock, the Director of Libraries. And the question on the table today is, what is information literacy? And so to address that, here's what we have in store for you. We will be defining information literacy and discussing what grounds a librarian's understanding of information literacy. We'll be introducing you to the ACRL framework that informs librarians' lesson planning and instruction. Got a little touchy with the keyboard there, sorry. And you're going to meet SIFT, a strategy that you can use when navigating the web and other information. And finally, how we can collaborate more thoroughly and incorporate information literacy in your classes. So what is information literacy? Let's start with some context. I have a news routine. Every morning I get up, I get a cup of coffee, and I listen to the news on the radio while scrolling through various apps on my phone. I might read an article or look at Instagram or book recommendations on TikTok. That's one of my new favorite things I've discovered. In the evening, I do something similar, but this time with herbal tea, and I try to end the day with a print book and put the screen away at least an hour before I go to bed. So perhaps you have a news routine. The constant stream of information that we encounter on a daily basis is astounding. It can come in the form of TV, print, or online news, podcasts, billboards, food labels, academic journals, advertisements, overt ones, or slyly in the form of paid content masquerading as news. Then there's the deluge of social media posts on an ever-expanding choice of platforms. This rate and intensity of consumption is often compared to drinking from the fire hose. Not only do we have access to more information than ever before in human history, but we as a society have come to expect instant information at our fingertips and in our pockets. With the ubiquity of fake news, be it misinformation, which is false or misleading information, but unintentionally created without the intention to harm, or disinformation, which is false information, but intentionally so, created with the intention to harm. It has become harder than ever to navigate the news and information narrative, to discern fact from fiction or fact from malicious fiction. It makes it harder than ever to build knowledge, to move from information, data, to knowledge, understanding, when you don't know what is reliable. A study by the Stanford Graduate School of Education, published in 2021, found that students demonstrated, quote, a near total inability to detect fake news on the internet. For this study, over 3,000 high school students, chosen to reflect the demographics of American high school students, were given a series of tasks to complete. And one such task, they were shown an anonymously produced video which circulated on Facebook in 2016, claiming to show ballot stuffing during the Democratic primary elections. And they were asked to determine whether it provided strong evidence of voter fraud. Less than 0.1% were able to determine that the video actually featured footage of voter fraud in Russia. In fact, Of the 3,443 study participants, only 3 individuals were able to do so. In another task, when asked to analyze a website proclaiming to disseminate factual reports about climate change, 95% failed to discover the publisher's ties to the fossil fuel industry. Instead, the students were convinced of the reliability of the site based on the website's appearance, the domain name, and the volume of information on the website, but not the quality. Dr. Sam Weinberg, one of the study's co-authors, states, "It presents a concerning picture of American students' ability to figure out who produced a given story, what their biases might have been, and whether the information is reliable. More troubling still is how easy it is for agents of disinformation to produce misleading or even deliberately false stories that carry the sheen of truth. Coupled with the instantaneous and global reach of today's social media, it does not bode well for the future of information integrity." In a further call to action, Joel Breakstone, the study's lead author, said on Stanford's website, "We have to train students to be better consumers of information." So how do we do that? How do we train students to be better consumers of information? But this is not an indictment of students. Is it just students? A Duquesne study found adults also have a poor ability to assess the credibility of a source. And a University of Warwick study showed that adults have difficulty distinguishing between original and altered images online. The reality is, most of us struggle with this because most of us were not taught the skills to navigate the news and media and do research in the digital age. And those skills are known as information literacy. And information literacy is relevant to any consumer of information. So when I started library school back in 2008, the common method for teaching the evaluation of a source was a checklist style exercise, usually following a clever acronym. One popular one is the CRAP test. We would advise students to systematically go through this checklist, and you'd end up with a sort of a red light or green light type result. And the results of these studies that I just shared suggest that traditional method of information source evaluation that librarians and other educators have been teaching are not adequate. They can lead researchers astray and don't encourage deep enough investigation. It is too easy now to present information that checks all the boxes, so to speak, but is still problematic. So now I'm going to pass it over to Samantha to dig into more deeply what information literacy is. Thanks. Apologies for being a short person. So librarians, our professional organization is the American Library Association, which has a sub-organization, ACRL, the Association of College and Research Libraries. And these are the organizations that produce the guiding documents that we look to in our practice. They certify our master's programs. And ACRL's current guiding document that we all look to is the Framework for Information Literacy, in which we define information literacy as the set of integrated abilities encompassing the reflective discovery of information, the understanding of how information is produced and valued, and the use of information in creating new knowledge and participating ethically in communities of learning. So this is a much more complex definition than I think many of us in the academic world think in. The older definition really focused on kind of information in and information out. But if we look to our current definition, you'll notice words like reflective discovery and understanding and participating. And it creates a much more complex definition that better demonstrates and reflects how people interact with the information world. Because our goal is not only to get students to know stuff and do things on command, but to change how they engage with the world within and beyond academia. So that shift has kind of come. We had multiple guiding documents. When Mechele was in library school getting her master's, the guiding document was the Information Literacy Competency Standards for Higher Education, which was developed in 2000. And that had a couple of hallmarks. Information literate was a kind of finite state. Students are or aren't. And it had very prescriptive things to look out for. So within that competency standards, there were 5 standards, 22 performance indicators, and each performance indicator listed approximately 4 or 5 possible outcomes. Our current framework, those outcomes were very specific. So things like selects controlled vocabulary specific to the discipline or information retrieval source. Our current document, the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education, which was developed 2015 and approved or kind of certified in 2016. So that's what we look to now, is a much more nuanced and complex document. It doesn't prescribe those outcomes. It's designed to be flexible and allow us to work within our own environment. We can tailor our learning outcomes and our assessments to the students that we have and the tasks that they're engaging with. The framework focuses on essential concepts and questions. In education, this is sometimes referred to as threshold concepts. So these are things that are hard to work to as an understanding, but once you get there, it kind of shifts your whole view and you never quite go back. And without surmounting those threshold concepts, it's hard to become a master. And the framework focuses on both knowledge practices and dispositions. So knowledge practices are the practical things that you might ordinarily kind of think of as learning outcomes. The knowledge practices use words like understand and articulate, recognize, decide. And the dispositions really focus on the attitudinal and valuing aspects. So they use words like accept and question and are conscious of. Folks who have been to one of mine and Megan Freebald's UDL talks might recognize some of this as, again, getting at that cognitive and emotional aspects of learning that really help people to engage. So the framework has 6 frames, and each frame has these kind of components. So there's a shorthand, which I'm going to introduce in a second. And then there's a larger, more expanded definition or expansion of the frame. There are the characteristic attitudes and behaviors of expert and novice learners, which are related to that frame. So that's another distinction between kind of the old standards where you either are or aren't information literate, but to a new framing of people start as novices, they learn as they go, and then get to expert navigators of information. And then it spells out some of the knowledge practices and some of the dispositions that we might look out for. So again, how do they demonstrate? How do they develop their understanding? And how do they develop the values and attitudes that accompany that understanding? The 6 frames in the ACRL framework are presented in alphabetical order as they are here, but that is not prescriptive. Part of the aspect is that there's no hierarchy, there's no prerequisites, and people may be in different places on that novice to expert spectrum within the different frames. So the frames that we look to, which when we do instruction, whether formally in the classroom or in consultation with students, these are always in the back of our head, is thinking about how are these introducing, or how is our interaction with the student mapping to these? Not necessarily all of them at the same time, usually only 1 or 2 in any given instruction session, but we think about how we can make these connections and help the students build that understanding. So the 6 frames are: authority is constructed and contextual. Information creation is a process. Information has value. The idea of research as inquiry. And the idea of scholarship as conversation. And finally, searching as strategic exploration. So again, very complex, very interconnected, much more reflective of what interacting with information in the world actually is. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, John, who's going to go into a little bit more detail about these frames.
Good afternoon. Excuse me. My name is John Hosford. I'm the art librarian at Scholes Library. As Samantha mentioned, the frames, and she's actually moved on to the page. This is an example of a page of the frames and what we use as a guide as we use the frameworks in our teaching. I am not going to show each frame in the full extent. I'm just going to go over a brief definition. One thing I did want to mention is that learners is prevalent in a lot of the frames, and I actually use the word researcher, thinking about maybe a little bit more positive and more proactive way of thinking about we're all researchers, students are researchers, they're researching, researchers, faculty are researching, that kind of thing. So that's a little bit of a change from the document itself. So the first framework is authority is constructed and contextual. And one of the knowledge practices, there are at least 7. One of the knowledge practices is for a researcher, the ability for a researcher to define different types of authority, such as subject expertise, societal position, or special experience. And then a disposition of the frame may ask the researcher to question the traditional notions of granting that authority and to recognize the value of diverse ideas and worldviews. The second frame is information creation as process, with the definition below. And a knowledge practice with that frame would be the researcher assesses the fit between the information product's creation process and the particular information need. So thinking about what form does that take? Is it an audio file or a tweet, for instance? And the disposition that a researcher might consider is resist the tendency to equate the format and with the underlying creation process. Information has value, and the definition. And one of the knowledge practices associated with this frame is articulate the purpose and distinguishing characteristics of copyright, fair use, open access, and the public domain. So knowing how the work was created, where it's held, and how it's to be shared. And then understanding how and why some individuals or group of individuals may be underrepresented or systematically marginalized within that system that produces and disseminates the information. So thinking about publishing in that respect. And a disposition that a researcher may consider would be seeing themselves as contributors to the information marketplace rather than just consumers of it. So that's a great example that I share with students when I do the teaching, is that don't think of yourself as just using information from a single standpoint. And then a second disposition for this frame would be that they would respect the original work of others. Research as inquiry is the frame and the definition there. Knowledge practice would be a researcher will formulate questions for research based on information gaps or the re-examination of existing, possibly conflicting information, and synthesize the ideas gathered from multiple sources. That's key, looking at multiple sources. One disposition would be considering the research as an open-ended exploration and engagement with the information. So it's not just looking at information in a rather static way. And then every librarian's favorite disposition is seek appropriate help when needed. Definitely a good thing to do. Scholarship as a conversation. And the definition. Knowledge practice, researchers cite the contributing work of others in their own information production. So again, key for students and faculty alike. And the disposition would be researcher recognizes that they often enter into an ongoing scholarly conversation and not a finished one. So again, it's ongoing, just as a conversation might be. And searching as a strategic exploration. Definition. Knowledge practice, using different types of searching language as appropriate. So think of controlled vocabulary, keywords, natural language. Consider natural language in the form of how I search in Google versus how I search in the library catalog. Natural language might not work as well. And then understanding how information systems or collections of recorded information are organized to access relevant information. So the researcher will do that. And then the two dispositions for searching as a strategic exploration is that the researcher will understand that first attempts at searching do not always produce adequate results. And then a researcher recognizes the value of browsing and other serendipitous methods of information gathering. Really important that you allow that process to happen. And I will pass the podium over to Kevin.
Thanks, John. Hi, I'm Kevin. I'm the information literacy librarian here at Alfred University. So as our profession has kind of grown and evolved and shifted away from the competency standards towards the framework, it has also shifted away from the checklists that we mentioned earlier towards more of a set of behaviors for navigating information. So when we think about the CRAP test, instead of using something like that, we're now thinking about ways that we can interact with information in a way that is guided by a specific set of behaviors that help us to navigate information. Checklists really only work when kind of these three things are satisfied. So the thing that you're checking is relatively easy to find, and it's really difficult to fake, which kind of, as we've established, that doesn't really exist anymore. There also has to be a good return on investment. So if you're going through a lengthy checklist to kind of go through each individual piece of evaluating every single website that you look at, for example, something that you see on Facebook or something that somebody sent you on TikTok or something that you see in a tweet, people don't really have time to go through these checklists when kind of as Mechele mentioned earlier, it can feel like we're drinking from the fire hydrant, right? There's just so much information coming at us at once. And finally, it needs to lead to a definitive decision, which is not always really practical. Sometimes we wind up with more of like a pro or con list to try to determine if we're actually going to look at a source and consider it to be reliable. This shift has really kind of started to happen as thinkers like Mike Caulfield, who's a really important scholar in information literacy right now, has written about that shift away from the checklist and into behaviors. And he's actually the one that developed this strategy that I'm going to be showing you all now. So this strategy is about starting to check a source to see if you'll trust it, if you'll use it, if you will share it on social media, if you would use it in a paper, if you find it to be trustworthy or not. And this is meant to be something that happens really quickly. This isn't meant to take a long time and is meant to be more of a set of behaviors that we can start to move through as we interact with all different kinds of information. And so, yeah, the letters SIFT stand for specific actions or behaviors that we can take. And I'll get into what each of these are, and then give a little bit of a demonstration of kind of what they can look like. So the first one, S, is going to be stop. So the first move is really simple, right? When you see something on social media or your aunt shares something with you via email, or you find something that you're considering incorporating into a paper, the first thing that you do before you use it is you stop and you just ask yourself, like, do I know that this is trustworthy? Can I use this? And then maybe move through the next parts of this process to identify whether or not it's trustworthy. The other part of stop is that as we're going through this process, if it starts to be really time consuming, if we find ourselves going down like kind of a fact checking rabbit hole, can't see the light of day anymore, it's time to stop, back out, figure out where we are, figure out what information we have, and kind of make a judgment call. Again, this is not something that's meant to take a super long time. So after you've stopped and you have decided that you're going to embark on this exploration, the next step is to start to investigate the source. So we're trying to find the answer to who is behind the information. Is the author an expert in the field? Is the publication considered to be trustworthy? And is there any conflict of interest or bias that we need to be aware of? Now, this can feel kind of similar to some of the checklists that have been used in the past, but what's really important and very different about the way that we do this now is that instead of staying on the website or the author's page, we move laterally across the internet and we open up new tabs and we look at other websites to find information about the source that we're looking at. You know, of course, they're going to tell us that they're trustworthy. They want us to stay on the page, to click on the ads, to generate revenue for them, or whatever their reason is. So this is where when I teach this to students, I introduce Wikipedia and we have a conversation about how Wikipedia can be used as a tool, because it's actually a really good place to go to get immediate and quick feedback about how trustworthy another source is. And so I will give a quick demonstration by looking at this website. So the Center for Immigration Studies is an example that I often give because it's a really interesting case study here. So if we do a Google search for the Center for Immigration Studies, and you all can kind of pretend that I'm typing into Google and all that, I have just pulled up the tabs to streamline this process a little bit. But if we pull up the Center for Immigration Studies website, it's going to be relatively difficult to really quickly decipher if this is going to be an okay website to use or not, right? They're not going to come right out and tell us if they're not trustworthy. If we spend a lot of time on it, we might be able to start to piece together that there might be some bias here. But, you know, if you scroll through their website, it's a .org. Students all the time tell me that they've heard that a .org means it's an organization and therefore it's trustworthy. We can see that they're publishing articles every single day. If you click on one of the authors, they give you a nice little blurb about who the author is, why they write for them, what their expertise is. And you can even go to their About page where they describe themselves as a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization that has testified before Congress over 130 times, right? So there's kind of a lot of trappings of what would normally make somebody think, okay, this is great. This is a trustworthy website. If we were to go back to the Google results and just go to the Wikipedia page, we would find a very different answer. So the Wikipedia page in the first sentence lays out a pretty big set of red flags here. So the Center for Immigration Studies is an anti-immigration think tank and an SPLC designated hate group. They go on to state that the group was founded by a white nationalist and eugenicist. And if you keep reading through, you can see all kinds of things that are going to cause issues. One of the biggest issues for me is that it states that they start to manipulate the data and information that they're presenting in order to advance their own viewpoints. So there are some pretty big red flags here. And of course, you know, because this is Wikipedia and anybody can edit it at any time, I'm glad it still says what it says last time I looked at it. You can actually follow up on the sources to double check. So, you know, if you wanted to look into how the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, designated them as a hate group, you could click on one of those links. Or if you wanted to find out more about the lawsuit that the CIS lost over this, then you can click on that and actually read through that as well. But again, so this piece only took probably 15 or 20 seconds. Once you get to the page, you can see really quickly, like, okay, I'm going to go find a different source. I don't necessarily want to stay here. And if we went through the website, it would take more time. Okay. And so that's investigating the source. The next step, if we, you know, think that it's a trustworthy source or aren't really sure, is to actually just try to find trusted coverage. So this is another move or behavior that we can use. And this is about evaluating the actual claim of the source. So we figure out what the source is claiming, and we take the next step of just doing kind of a Google search to see if we can find other sources that say the same thing. For people that are still developing sources that they trust, you know, that's something that happens over time. Probably a lot of you already know that you trust specific newspapers, you don't really like others. And so what you're looking for is things that are, you know, enough massive sources that are trustworthy are all saying the same thing. I give a rule of 3 as a good starting point usually. And other sources that you can use outside of newspapers are like fact-checking organizations. Even if you can find like scholarly peer-reviewed articles, those are great also. So the last piece that I really stress for students that are kind of new to this is that if you don't know a source that you're looking at, then do what we just did. It's called reading laterally, to go to the Wikipedia page or to another website to find out if that source is trustworthy or not. But again, this is about investigating the claim. So a little bit of a warning here. We're going to get into some images of spiders here in the next couple of minutes. So I hope that's okay with everybody. So this ran a little while back. It was all over my social media when I woke up one morning. It's kind of alarming, right? A spider as big as the palm of your hand could soon invade the East Coast, scientists say. And so let me see if I can still navigate here. I think I just have to be careful. Okay, so pretending that I pulled up a Google search, we would see a lot of different hits, and it would take some scrolling through to find ones that you think might be trustworthy. But again, what we're just looking for, because this is meant to be pretty quick, is Washington Post. Okay, I trust it for the most part. And okay, what are they saying? That here comes something called the Joro spider. Upon reading a little bit further, that's the same spider that was being referenced earlier. There are other results that come up. There's one from the Smithsonian Magazine as well. So we could read a little bit more from them. But instead of reading deeply into any of these articles, what I'm looking for across the search results is to find if there are at least a few other sources that I trust that all say the same thing. Once I've done that, okay, great. I can either stop there or keep digging a little bit. All right, and so that's really just kind of about finding the trusted coverage. And so then the last letter of SIFT is tracing claims back to their original context. I'm going to continue with that spider piece because I think it's kind of fun. But what we're not going to touch on so much is something that was brought up earlier in this talk, is that videos and photographs really often get taken out of context. And so there are ways that you can do reverse searches to like figure out where those images originally came from. That's something that you can figure out how to do pretty quickly on Google, and something to keep in mind when you're tracing claims in the form of like visual media. I'm going to focus more on just kind of finding out where the original pieces of information came for studies that get circulated all over the internet, like this one. So what happens really often, as some of you might be aware, is that study about the spiders was one study, probably a scientific, academic, peer-reviewed study, and it's just been circulated and probably doesn't say the exact same thing. And so what we want to do is figure out where that study originally came from and figure out what it says, see if we actually trust it. Okay, so I'm going to take us to a website that I really am not sure what it is. Axios is a website that I'm not super familiar with. And this is going to be, we're going to pretend that I didn't do the stuff that I just did where I Googled and I found a few other sources that all said the same thing. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to trace the links that show up in here to try to get back to the original study. So again, this is kind of about the same thing, these giant, weird, colorful, disturbing spiders that may or may not be coming to the East Coast. So you know, you can try to find the original study in a number of ways. You can use keyword searching in Google, but one of my favorite ways is to follow the links in the article. So it makes it easier if you're just like looking at something on Twitter, it's in one app, you can click around on the links to try to get to the original study. And so this one, right, really at the very beginning states that it's getting this information from the University of Georgia. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this and see where it takes me. Rather than taking me to an academic article, this brings me to UGA Today, which looks like it's some kind of like PR publication for the University of Georgia. Looks like they're trying to hype up the research that's being done at their university. And so I see that they're kind of using a similar headline that I've seen across other websites. But I'm really interested in finding the original study. So at this point, again, I'm going to scroll through and try to find links. Sometimes it can be kind of tricky to find the link to the original study. So, you know, I'm looking for keywords like academic journal article, peer-reviewed study, just study or research or something that's going to lead me to where it originally came from. And so as you scroll down, it's kind of hidden down here past all these different pictures of spiders. But eventually you get to the piece where they say where it was published and it links to the study. So once you click on this, it'll open up. And now you'll actually be looking at the official study that it came from. And I'll give a quick summary kind of the abstract and how they got here. But the scientists looked at a a similar invasive spider that wasn't able to survive in as cold of temperatures as the Joro spider, but it has a lot of other similarities in where it came from and the way that it's been spreading. And they figured out that the Joro spider can withstand colder temperatures. So there's this possibility that it may be able to spread further up along the East Coast from Georgia, where it's very prevalent right now. They don't necessarily say that it's definitely coming to the East Coast, right? And so some of these headlines, like the Washington Post is one of them that said, the Joro spider is coming. It didn't say exactly where, but we don't really probably need to be too concerned in Alfred. I don't think. Once from looking at this. So again, we could have stopped at any point along the way to say like, okay, like maybe I should be concerned about this. But if you're really concerned and you want to go to the like actual original source and see what it says. Okay, so that's SIFT kind of in a nutshell. I think I have a segue written down here, but yeah, so SIFT again is like behaviors that we go through, right? It's not a checklist. At any point along the way, we could have stopped. We don't necessarily have to do each step of these. You can just take any given one to investigate anything that you're looking at. And it kind of represents the shift away from what had been like a checklist or the competency standards into this more kind of holistic way of thinking about a framework for looking at information and understanding what we are encountering all the time. Pass it over to Michele.
Hey. So I'm sort of bookending us here, and I'm going to wrap things up with a story. I shared a brief story about my information, my news routine in the mornings. And so I'm going to close with a story. Occasionally when I think about information literacy and the sometimes dire real world consequences of mis and disinformation, or when I go through the steps to evaluate something that I saw or read, only to find out that it was false or even an outright lie, that can sometimes feel really hopeless or overwhelming, or like everything you read is false or nothing is true at all. And what can I trust? And like, why try? You can start to get really cynical about this topic. So I wanted to share two quick experiences that I recently had that when I used information literacy that turned out very differently from each other. A few weeks ago, I came across a social media post that was an excerpt from a speech attributed to Pope Francis. And it was just the kind of like peace and love, positivity that gets me excited, the kind of thing that I want to hear a world leader say. And I felt the repost tingle come on really strong. But I decided to stop. And so I did just a quick Google search, and I found out that it was not a speech from Pope Francis. It's something that's like just circulated and attributed, no official record. It turned out not to be true, and I was very disappointed. And in another example, I saw a post about sanitation workers in Turkey who started saving books that were being thrown out in the garbage and collecting them, and that they started a library in their community. So that is just the kind of peace and love thing that would get me excited. And I felt that repost tingle coming on strong. But again, I stopped and I searched for it. And I found out that a lot of news stories and references to this. And it turns out that there is a library in Turkey started by sanitation workers, and other people have brought books, and the library has grown. And that was a wonderful discovery that made me feel really good about the process and how sometimes these things can turn out. So in closing, to quote Dr. Sam Weinberg again, the ability to determine what is reliable and what is not is the new basic skill in our society, and it is a daily skill. So like tying your shoes or cooking a meal, our hope is that we will be teaching information literacy, all of us, right alongside other basic skills. So now we have defined the problem. You've seen the role librarians can play in teaching information literacy, and we've demonstrated some strategies for your classroom or for your life. And so we have decided to start the Q&A right now by asking the first question ourselves. And so we would like to ask you here or on Zoom, how can we collaborate? And my colleagues are going to join me on the stage for questions.
Thank you. If you have questions, please use the microphone so people on the Zoom can hear.
Hi, did you say that the strategies like SIFT had replaced a previous system called CRAP? Did I mishear, or is that the what did CRAP stand for, and what was the problem with CRAP? Why has it been replaced?
If I can, it's not, we don't use it as much. Well, some people still use it. I guess I should say it, you'll find it still in use. If I can remember correctly, I believe it's currency, reliability, authority, accuracy, and purpose, I think. And so each one of those has some subsets below. Then you're like, so it's like, who is the author? Found it. You know, like what's their agenda? Like all that, you know, it's just a very much like it's almost like a worksheet that you would fill out. And then it's like, good. So I used to teach middle school, and I would teach this, but almost in knowing at the time even that it was inadequate, I would teach students how to do it. And we'd do a source, sort of staging like a mixed bag of like, okay, that was true, that was not. And then I would always follow it up with the example. Try Googling this. It's a great website for this kind of exercise. So it's to protect the endangered Pacific Northwest tree octopus. And this is a site currently maintained. It checks all the boxes. And so it was so sort of like, oh, but you still have to use your brain. Right. Well, so what was the what was the purpose of that test? Like if I have to end it with, you still have to do all of this and critical thinking on top of that, which I guess that's the point. Well, that's what we need to teach then, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I can take this one.
It's a double A in CRAP, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. And the CRAP test is an interesting one because it starts out with the currency. And of course, it was established in the early 2000s, and just so it kind of fails its own test because information has just evolved so much at this point that that's not really how we engage with it. So we have a question in the chat. So I'll go ahead and read this.
Could you read the question out loud?
Yeah, absolutely. Your advice to investigate the sources sound, but in the real world, how many of us have the time to do this research? And when the information that we read or see on Facebook or Reddit confirms our biases, what is the likelihood that normal human beings will do or want to do the kind of investigation that you promote? Yeah, and I think that this is a really good question. So first, I think that we all have time, right? We saw that the investigating the source piece could just take a matter of like 30 seconds. It's typing in the author or creator of the source and seeing if you can find any information about them. And if you can, then great. If not, then maybe it deserves a little bit further digging. But I think that the other important piece of this is that there's a strong element of just critical thinking that comes in here, where you just kind of have to start to be able to identify the ways that you might be able to follow up on something and try to investigate it. The piece about actually wanting to do something, though, I don't know. I think that definitely when I see something that confirms even my own biases, I have a tendency to not necessarily want to dig into it. And I think that that's something that we need to be cautious of and wary of. And I don't really have like the answer for how to encourage that behavior in others, because I'm still figuring it out in myself. But it's definitely something that I try to be aware of and just try to think of it in terms of like, well, you know, just because something confirms what I want to believe, I really want to make sure that what I actually believe is like based in fact at some point along the way. And so that's kind of just the starting point, I guess. But thank you. That's a great question.
Jump in with a quick addition. So one of the kind of earlier iterations of SIFT from Mike Caulfield, he articulated as 4 moves and a habit. And it's building that habit specifically of that first step of just like stop. That goes double if it makes you feel that repost tingle or gets you really angry. If you have an emotional response where, you know, yes, if you don't want to investigate, you're not going to. But the idea is really to help people build that habit of just every time you encounter something on your Facebook or in life, just take that second to like breathe, process, and then proceed.
More questions?
While we're getting the microphone, are you guys thinking about the answer to our question?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, your question. I'm going to skip over your question because we're already doing that. But a while ago, many years ago, John had said something to me that he had picked up at a conference. He may not even remember this, but we had a discussion, and he said, you know, the people we're teaching have been searching since the day they were born. They've been clicking on things and typing in things and clicking for many, many years. Is any of the stuff that is involved in any of these techniques for information literacy, is some of that information and practice and good practice intrinsic when you're born with it and you start and you grow up with it and you know what you're looking for when you're 3? Aren't you better at looking for something when you're 13? Just a question. I was just wondering if any of these materials come as a.
So I'm remembering that conversation, and it's one that I sort of still use, and I use it with an image of a big Converse sneaker right next to a 4-inch stiletto heel. And I asked the students, have you ever gone to Amazon and mistakenly gotten the Converse when you're trying to search for and get the 4-inch heel? And of course, nobody has done that. So we are all good searchers, I think, to some extent. But it's really the context and thinking about the frames where we have to know what we're searching for. We have to know what language, whether we're using a database, a library database, or Google Scholar, how that language, how those, our thought process changes for the search we're doing. And I don't think that answers your question, but it was more about the conversation we had.
Time for one more question. Well, I'll ask it then. How do we know that we can trust you guys as an authority?
That's a good question. We do.
Who had a question?
Yep. Yeah,
You want me to do it anyway?
Yep.
Okay, so thinking about the SIFT process and so on, how far has artificial intelligence come in setting up something where we can click on one doohickey and get all of those steps taken care of for us when we or our students are too busy, or we want an answer too soon? Is there anything on board for automating that SIFT or something similar to it?
Yes-ish. So there are occasionally services or browser add-ons that will kind of flag at least known sources of misinformation. You might have seen this on Twitter or YouTube when you start pulling up posts about, say, COVID. It's got that little warning banner that says, oh, hey, go to the CDC website. The long answer is not really, because this is a complex and human process, and humans are going to always be better than computers about thinking about different ways to trick people. Sometimes on purpose, disinformation. Sometimes you just didn't present it in the way that the computer is looking for, and suddenly you're falling into that unintentional misinformation trap. And again, thinking about creating not just people who are good clickers, right? Everybody can get a search result at this point. Like was alluded to earlier, our students and many of us have been clicking on stuff for a long time. How do we build that more complex understanding of and relation to information that incorporates these additional aspects of, like, oh, I'm not just a consumer, I'm a participant. How do we build these habits and these more thoughtful engagement? So I would argue that even if it were really well automated, that we would still want to be teaching this process.
Okay, well, we're sort of out of time. If people have got more questions, please come to the front. I would say one thing, that the announcement I gave earlier about next week's Berggruen Forum, it can be totally relied on. It comes out of the Division of Human Studies, a well-known authority. But let's thank the presenters again.